constructed the temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 4, he continues making the furniture for the temple. When we get to chapter 5, it says, "So all the work that Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished." There's something about finishing a great project. Oh, the feeling is almost euphoric. I remember Acts 14:26, when they had completed that mission trip, the work that they had completed. And it says it there in Acts 14:26. There was something about getting a finish, a finality to that work that they had done. And they could celebrate that and prepare to do even greater works, which they did. In John 19:30, when Jesus was on the cross, he said, "It is finished." And that did not mean he was defeated. It meant that he had finished doing his mission. He came to die for the sins of the world, and it was finished. He had finished the work that God had given him to do. We see this again in chapter 7, verse 11, where Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house. So he built his own king's house, a palace, but more importantly, he built the temple where God would meet with his people. It says there that Solomon successfully accomplished all that came into his heart to make in the house of the Lord and in his own house. So he had his own house in order, and more importantly, he had God's house in order. So Solomon started off correctly. And the beauty of Solomon's temple was so beautiful that after its destruction, and after God's people had gone into captivity for 70 years, when they came back to rebuild the temple, and they finally did rebuild the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had burned, those older people that could remember Solomon's temple, when they saw the new temple that they had rebuilt was inferior, they wept because they remembered the glory of Solomon's temple, and it was much greater than what they were able to rebuild. But God confirmed his covenant from verses 12 and following in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And here we run into a verse that's often quoted and I think is not appropriately understood or applied. I was on Jordan Lane here in Huntsville driving, and I saw a sign. It had 2 Chronicles 7:14 on it, and it said, "Pray." Now, that is what the verse says. It does say that we ought to pray, but that's not all it says. There are many other things that this verse says. And notice it doesn't just say people in general pray. It says, "I want my people who are called by my name to pray." So just advertising to the public in general to pray is not necessarily what this is. Well, it's not at all what this is about. This verse is about people coming to terms with God. And it's in a time when they really need God. Let me go back to chapter 6 and put this in its context. In chapter 6, verse 24, we find Solomon praying to God. And he's praying about the future and about the nation that he's going to lead, the nation of Israel, the people of God. He says, "If your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you." Now listen to that. If your people are defeated because they've sinned against you, that sounds like punishment, doesn't it? That's exactly what he's getting at. He says, "Because they've sinned against you, and return and confess your name and pray and make supplication before you in this temple." So here are people who've recognized their defeat because they've sinned against God. And they start wanting to make things right with God. So they, number one, they return to God. And I'm in 2 Chronicles 6:24. They return to God, they confess his name, they pray and make supplication to God in that temple that he had just finished building. Then he asks God, verse 25, "Then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the land which you gave them and their fathers." Now listen to verse 26. "When heaven is shut up and there's no rain because they have sinned against you, when they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin because you afflict them." See, God punishes sinners. It's not just eternal punishment. God deals with his people as an earthly father would deal with a wayward son or daughter. Our earthly fathers, according to Hebrews chapter 12, discipline us according to what wisdom they have. And it's because they love us. Spare the rod, spoil the child, as it were. And so God disciplines those he loves. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens and disciplines every son he receives. And so God will sometimes discipline us with things in our environment, allowing storms to come into our life, reversals, setbacks. This morning we talked about the horrible pit that Jeremiah had experienced, or that David had experienced, and that Jeremiah also experienced, being thrown into a horrible pit, sinking into the miry clay. Well, these people would recognize that because of their sin, God was allowing them to face affliction. And so they were turning back to God, praying toward the temple and confessing God's name and turning from their sin because they recognized God was afflicting them, chastening them, disciplining them. Verse 27, Solomon says, "Then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, that you may teach them the good way in which they should walk, and send rain on your land which you have given to your people as an inheritance." God could withhold the rain as a punishment, or make it rain too much as a punishment. Sometimes he withheld rain, like in the days of Elijah, or make it rain too much, like he did in the days of Noah. Now, he won't make it rain that much. The rainbow reminds us of that. But he will allow storms to afflict us, and we can learn and be disciplined by setbacks. But we can also learn and be taught the good way in which we can walk during setbacks. Notice verse 28, "When there is famine in the land, pestilence or blight or mildew, locusts or grasshoppers, when their enemies besiege them in the land of their cities, whatever plague or whatever sickness there is." Could we throw in COVID-19? I mean, is there a better word than pestilence? Is there a better word than plague or whatever sickness there is? I don't know that COVID-19 is an affliction from the Lord, but also do not know that it's not. God can use and work through the things in this world, and I do know this, that man has turned his back on God. America has turned its back on God. We are aborting babies by the millions and have since 1973 legally in this country. And we have some of the same people crying out for abortion who are commending those who are saving lives from the coronavirus. And it doesn't make sense if you think about it. You wonder, what is the agenda behind all of this? People can certainly work through circumstances to do evil, and God can work through circumstances to do good. Remember Joseph's brothers? They took those circumstances they had and they meant it for evil, to sell their brother into bondage. But God meant that bondage for good, because Joseph ended up being the savior of his family. So we find that whatever plague or whatever sickness there is, he says, verse 29, "Whatever prayer, whatever supplication is made by anyone or by all your people Israel, when each one knows his own burden and his own grief and spreads out his hands to this house, then hear from heaven your dwelling place and forgive and give to everyone according to all his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of men, that they may fear you, to walk in your ways as long as they live in the land which you gave to our fathers." I wish Solomon had followed his own advice there, his own prayer. But he prayed to God that people would recognize their affliction and then pray about it. Pray about their specific burden, specific to themselves, and spread out their hands before God and pray to God who dwells in heaven, and pray toward the meeting place, the temple on earth that Solomon had built, where God would meet with his people on earth. And God who alone knows the hearts of man, could hear and answer their prayer accordingly. You see, it's not just a ritual. Prayer is not a ritual that we go through. If you ask people, do you pray? Most people will say yes. There are even atheists who say they pray. They say there's something about unburdening ourselves by talking things out. And they'll talk out into the air even if they don't believe in a God. But we find in the New Testament, when Peter was arrested for preaching the gospel, that prayer was made by the church for Peter to God. What God were they praying to? Oh, the same God you read about in both Old and New Testaments. The true and living God. Now, that's the God they prayed to. And that's the only God that will answer prayer effectively. All other gods are false. And all other prayers are just fruitless exercises, empty words. And so prayer is not just an end within itself, but it's a means whereby we talk to God and make supplication before his throne, because he alone knows our hearts. Therefore he knows our burdens, both individually and collectively, even as far as nations and globally. God knows what's going on in our world. Notice he says in verse 35, he says, hear from heaven their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause when they sin against you, for there's no one who does not sin. And you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they take them captive to a land far or near. Yet when they come to themselves in the land where you carried them where they were carried captive, and repent and make supplication to you in the land of their captivity, saying, we have sinned, we've done wrong and have acted wickedly, and when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their captivity, where they have been carried captive, and pray toward their land which you gave to their fathers, toward the city which you have chosen, and toward the temple which I have built for your name, then hear from heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their supplications, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Daniel was one of those carried captive to a foreign land. 3 times a day he would open his windows toward Jerusalem and pray, because he was following this very information. And he confessed the sins of his people. And these people were doing more than just praying. When they realized that their hardships had come about somewhat related to their sin, not all hardship comes about as a result of sin, but some certainly does. And these were being punished because of their sin, and so they had to come to themselves. And even in their captivity in a foreign land, some people don't come to themselves until they're in a foreign land. Take, for instance, the prodigal son who went to a foreign land and spent his father's substance. He wasted it. And when he was eating what the pigs ate, it says that he came to himself, and he repented himself and went back to his father's house, begging to be a slave. That is the humble attitude of a person returning to God. And we find that God's people would have to go through this process.